The John Deere dealer's laugh echoed across the lot that April morning in 1985. Not a polite chuckle, a real gut-busting laugh. Ray Hutchkins stood there in worn coveralls next to his 1947 Farmall H, bright red and purring like the day it rolled off the assembly line. The dealer couldn't stop grinning. This was going to be the easiest pitch of his career, or so he thought. Anyone still farming with equipment this old isn't serious about making money, the dealer said, wiping tears from his eyes. He walked Ray past rows of brand new 4450s and 4650s, machines with air-conditioned cabs and enough horsepower to pull 12 bottom plows. The future, he explained, belonged to men who understood leverage, men who knew how to use other people's money to get big fast. He showed Ray the financing options, the dealer incentives, the federal tax advantages. Then he glanced back at that ancient Farmall and delivered the final insult. 500, and only because I feel sorry for you. Ray drove home in silence. His wife Margaret asked what happened. He said we're behind the times, Ray muttered. She didn't ask anything else. 22 years of marriage had taught her how Ray thought about things. But what Ray was thinking would eventually bankrupt that dealer and dozens of farmers just like him. See, Ray understood something about debt that everyone else had forgotten by 1985, something his father had learned the hard way during the Great Depression, something that was about to save his family while destroying an entire generation of farmers around him. That Farmall wasn't just paid off, it had been paid off since 1952. It had plowed every acre of their 240 acres more times than anyone could count. Ray did all his own maintenance, kept detailed records, and that tractor had never spent a single day in a repair shop. The fuel cost him a third of what the new diesels consumed, but more importantly, it didn't come with debt, and debt was about to become a death sentence. This was the middle of the farm crisis that started around 1980, though most people didn't realize how catastrophic it would become. Land prices had exploded through the 1970s, driven by grain embargoes, inflation, and blind faith that farmland could only go one direction, up. In 1970, an acre of decent Iowa farmland sold for $500. By 1980, try $3,000 or more. Farmers who'd been careful their entire lives suddenly started thinking like Wall Street speculators. They borrowed against land they owned to buy more land. They traded paid-off equipment for new machines worth $60,000 or $80,000, financed at variable interest rates that seemed reasonable. The thinking was simple. Inflation would keep pushing up the value of everything they owned. The debt would become easier to pay off with cheaper dollars. It had worked for their fathers after World War II, when inflation erased Depression-era debts. Except this time, something different happened. Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve decided that breaking inflation was more important than protecting farm incomes. They pushed interest rates into the stratosphere. The prime rate hit 21.5% in December 1980. Farmers who'd taken out variable rate loans at 9 or 10% suddenly found themselves paying 15, 16, 18% on money they owed. At the exact same time, grain prices collapsed. Corn that brought $3.20 a bushel in 1980 dropped to $2.40 by 1982 and kept falling. Land values followed. That $3,000 acre from 1980 might be worth $2,200 in 1985, if you could even find a buyer. The math stopped working. A farmer paying 18% interest on a $250,000 loan needed to generate $45,000 a year just to cover the interest before paying a single dollar of principal, before feeding his family, before buying seed or fertilizer or fuel. The dealer in Cedar Falls had been right about one thing. The future did belong to people who understood leverage. He just had the direction backwards. The farmers who truly understood leverage in 1985 were the ones who understood what happens when it works against you. Ray Hutchkins had watched his own father nearly lose everything in the 1930s. He'd learned that ownership beats payments every single time. His 240 acres had been in the family since 1919, when his grandfather paid $12,000 for the whole parcel, a price that seemed insane because land had been selling for $60 an acre just years before. But his grandfather paid cash, and that decision saved them when the Depression hit. Ray's father inherited a farm with no mortgage in 1941, right when land prices were starting to recover, but still low enough that he could add another 80 acres. Cash again. When Ray took over in 1963, he inherited 320 acres, completely paid for, along with equipment that was old but functional. Ray's approach looked simple from the outside, but it required a specific kind of discipline that most people didn't have. He bought used equipment from estate sales or neighbors who were upgrading. He paid cash. He did his own repairs. He planted fewer acres in corn and more in hay and oats, crops that didn't require expensive inputs. He kept 30 head of beef cattle, not because they made him rich, but because they provided steady baseline income that didn't depend entirely on grain markets. He and Margaret lived in the same house his grandfather built. They drove vehicles until the frames rusted out. They didn't take vacations. Margaret sewed most of her own clothes and canned vegetables from a garden covering half an acre. To everyone else, especially by 1985 standards, they looked poor. They looked like people being left behind by progress. The dealer probably forgot about Ray within an hour, but Ray didn't forget about the dealer. All through 1985 and 1986, Ray watched farms around him collapse like dominoes. The Morrisons, 3 miles east, had a beautiful operation, 800 acres, newest equipment, a machine shed that looked like an airplane hangar. They'd expanded aggressively in 1979 and 1980, buying land at peak prices with variable rate loans. By spring 1986, they were gone. The bank sold everything at auction. The land went for $1,800 an acre, about 60% of what the Morrisons paid. The Kowalskis, who'd farmed the same section since the 1890s, lost half their land. The Hendricksons lost everything except the 80 acres that had been their original homestead. Ray went to those auctions, not to gawk, but to watch and think. Here's what was happening. An entire generation of farmers had made the same bet at the same time. They'd bet that inflation would continue, that land prices would keep rising, that grain prices would stay strong, that interest rates would stay reasonable. Every single assumption was wrong. But worse, they'd structured their operations so that all those assumptions had to be true simultaneously. There was no margin for error, no cushion for bad years, no ability to wait out a downturn. When conditions changed, the businesses collapsed. By 1987, the dealer in Cedar Falls was struggling. The factory had cut dealer incentives. Farmers who might have bought new equipment were either broke or too scared to take on debt. The dealer had a lot full of unsold tractors and combines, millions of dollars in inventory he'd financed himself. He'd built his business on volume, on moving metal, on the assumption that farmers would keep upgrading every few years. When that stopped, his cash flow dried up. Ray heard through the local farm bureau that the dealer was trying to sell out, but there weren't many buyers for a John Deere dealership in the middle of Iowa in 1987. Ray didn't gloat. That wasn't his nature. But he did start paying closer attention to land prices and which farms were coming up for sale. In fall 1987, the farm directly north of his place, 160 acres of good ground, went up for auction. The previous owner had died, and his kids didn't want to farm. Ray had been saving money for nearly 25 years. He and Margaret had put aside every dollar they didn't absolutely need to spend. They'd kept it in certificates of deposit and treasury bills, instruments that paid interest but didn't risk the principal. They had almost $80,000 in savings, an amount that seemed modest compared to what some farmers had been borrowing, but it was real money that actually existed. Ray went to that auction, stood quietly in the back, and bought those 160 acres for $900 an acre. He paid cash. The land was worth at least $1,500 an acre, even in the depressed market of 1987. Probably more, but there weren't many people around who could write a check for $144,000. Ray could. 3 years later, in 1990, another neighboring farm came available, 200 acres. The owner had held on through the crisis but was retiring. His children had moved to Des Moines and Omaha with no interest in coming back. The land sold at private sale for $1,100 an acre. Ray bought it, cash again. By the end of 1990, Ray Hutchkins owned 7 to 20 acres of debt-free farmland in central Iowa. He was 58 years old, still driving that 1947 Farmall for most of his field work, though he'd also picked up a 1960 John Deere 3010 at an estate sale for $3,500, about a tenth of what it would have cost new. The dealer in Cedar Falls closed his doors in 1991. Ray read about it in the Waterloo Courier. The article said the dealership had been unable to compete with larger operations and had been hurt by the long downturn in farm equipment sales. It didn't mention anything about laughing at old tractors or telling farmers they weren't serious. Ray folded the paper and set it aside. He had hay to cut. What Ray understood and what the dealer never understood was the difference between looking successful and being successful. The dealer's lot had been full of shiny new machines. His showroom was clean and modern. He wore nice clothes and drove a new pickup truck. He looked like he was winning. But his business model required a constant flow of customers taking on debt. When that flow stopped, he had nothing to fall back on. Ray's place, Wayne's Cosmos, by contrast, looked poor. His equipment was old. His buildings needed paint. He didn't have a new pickup. But his operation could survive almost anything because it didn't depend on external credit, on rising asset values, or on perfect market conditions. He could have a bad year, even several bad years, and still be fine because he wasn't making loan payments. The lack of debt wasn't just a financial advantage, it was strategic freedom. It meant he could wait. It meant he could make decisions based on what made sense for his operation, rather than what the bank required. It meant that when everyone else was forced to sell, he could buy. By 2000, Ray was 68 and thinking about succession. His son Tom had come back to the farm in 1994 after working construction in Minneapolis for 6 years. Tom had seen what happened to farms in the 1980s. He'd learned the same lessons his father learned just a generation later. Together, they farmed 720 acres with equipment most modern farmers would consider junk. The 1947 Farmall was still running. So was the 1960 3010. They'd added a 1975 International 1066 purchased at auction for $8,000. Their newest piece of equipment was a 1988 grain drill they'd bought used in 1996. None of it was impressive to look at. All of it was paid for. The John Deere dealership building in Cedar Falls sat empty for a few years, then got converted into a furniture store. The big overhead doors where tractors used to roll in and out were sealed up with concrete blocks and vinyl siding. If you drove past it in 2000, you'd have no idea what it used to be. The farms that went under in the 1980s were mostly still there, the land anyway, but they'd been consolidated into larger operations, often owned by investors or by the few farmers who'd survived with enough capital to expand. The Morrison place was owned by a hog production company out of North Carolina. The Kowalski land had been absorbed by a farmer from 3 counties over who ran 5,000 acres. The landscape looked the same, but the ownership had completely changed. Ray's story isn't particularly dramatic if you're looking for big, emotional moments. He didn't save anyone. He didn't invent anything. He didn't fight any great battles. What he did was make one consistent decision over and over again for more than 40 years. He refused to confuse access to money with having money. That's a subtle distinction, but it's the difference between surviving and disappearing. In the 1980s, farmers had tremendous access to money. Banks were eager to lend. The federal government provided tax incentives for equipment purchases. Dealers offered financing that required almost nothing down, Access had never been easier. But access isn't the same as ownership, and debt isn't the same as wealth. The people who laughed at Ray, who thought he was behind the times, who believed that farming with old equipment meant he didn't understand modern agriculture, they were making a fundamental error. They were measuring success by activity, by expansion, by visible markers of growth. Ray was measuring success by resilience, by the ability to withstand shocks, by the freedom that comes from not owing money. When the shocks came, and they always come eventually, the difference between those two approaches became obvious. The people who looked successful in 1980 were often gone by 1990. The person who looked poor in 1980 owned 3 farms by 2000. The John Deere dealer who laughed at Ray's old tractor in 1985 probably never understood what happened to him. From his perspective, he'd done everything right. He'd run an aggressive business. He'd pushed sales. He'd taken advantage of factory incentives and dealer financing. He'd told farmers what the experts were saying about modern agriculture and economies of scale, but he'd built his business on the assumption that conditions would remain favorable. And when they didn't, he had no fallback position. He was all in on one specific version of the future. When that version didn't materialize, he was finished. Ray's approach wasn't exciting. It didn't make for good conversation at the coffee shop. It didn't impress anyone. For decades, it probably seemed like he was sacrificing quality of life for no good reason. Why live so simply? Why drive old equipment? Why not enjoy some of the prosperity that seemed all around? But Ray wasn't sacrificing quality of life. He was defining it differently. His quality of life came from security, from ownership, from the freedom that comes with not being leveraged. He could sleep at night. He could make decisions based on what he thought was right, rather than what the bank demanded. He could wait out bad markets. He could say no to dealers and salesmen and government programs that didn't make sense for his operation. That kind of freedom has a value that's hard to measure, but easy to feel when you don't have it. By the time Ray and Margaret retired and turned the operation fully over to Tom in 2003, the farm had become something unusual in modern American agriculture. A mid-sized, family-owned operation with no debt, run with old equipment, producing modest but reliable returns year after year. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't innovative. It wasn't going to be featured in any farming magazines. But it had outlasted almost everyone who'd started farming in the same area at the same time. And it had done so without drama, without crisis, without begging banks for extensions or restructuring debt, or selling off pieces to survive. It had simply persisted, which turned out to be the most radical thing it could have done. We live in an economy that constantly encourages us to maximize leverage, to use other people's money to grow faster, to expand our lifestyle or business, to match our access to credit, rather than our actual earnings. We're told that debt is a tool, that inflation will make it easier to pay back over time, that we're leaving money on the table if we're not borrowing to invest. And sometimes, under specific conditions, that advice is correct. But it's only correct if a very particular set of assumptions holds true. That interest rates stay low, that asset values keep rising, that income remains stable or grows, that no unexpected shocks disrupt the system. When any one of those assumptions breaks, leverage stops being a tool and becomes a trap. Ray Hutchins operated with different assumptions. He assumed bad things would happen eventually. He assumed markets would turn against him at some point. He assumed the confident predictions of experts and dealers and bankers would sometimes be wrong. He structured his life and business to survive those moments, rather than to maximize growth during good times. That meant he grew slower. It meant he looked poorer. It meant people laughed at him. But it also meant that when the crisis came, he was one of the few people in a position to take advantage of it, to buy land at distressed prices. to expand his operation at exactly the moment when everyone else was contracting. The dealer who laughed walked away from Ray thinking he'd won that encounter. He had the shiny equipment, the confident sales pitch, the backing of one of the biggest machinery companies in the world. Ray drove home in a 38-year-old tractor. But 6 years later, the dealer was trying to sell a failing business, and Ray was writing cash checks for farmland. The story raises questions worth thinking about. How much of the farm crisis was about individual decisions versus structural forces? Were farmers who borrowed aggressively being irresponsible, or responding rationally to incentives and expert advice that turned out wrong? Is there something about human nature that makes us incapable of resisting leverage when it's offered? And in an economy built on credit and growth and leverage, is it even possible for most people to live the way Ray lived? These are questions without clear answers. But the assumptions we make about them shape every financial decision we make, from the smallest personal choice to the largest national policy. Ray Hutchins made his assumptions, placed his bets accordingly, and lived long enough to see how they worked out. Most of us won't know if we chose correctly until much later. Until the dealer is either still there or gone. Until we're still farming or the land belongs to someone else. If this story made you think twice about what success really means, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have driven the old tractor or bought the new one? And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, share it with them right now.